I have a question for you, and I want you to be really honest with yourself when you answer it. When did you last think about boycotting something? Was it after a video went viral, after an acquittal, after something happened to someone who looked like you and I, and the outrage was too big for you to ignore? My follow up question to that is when did that feeling fade? Was it a week later, a month later, when the next thing happened and the attention moved, when you realized that the boycott had no clear demands and no real way to measure whether anything had changed? I'm not asking this to shame you. I am asking it because the pattern that you may have just traced in your own memory, that pattern has been repeating for over 100 years. Outrage, mobilization, participation, exhaustion, return to baseline, wait for the next tragedy, repeat. I call it the rage cycle. And we have been in it for long enough that most of us have stopped noticing it's a cycle at all. We think this is just how organizing works. We think this is just what the Black economic power looks like in practice. And I want to tell you today that it's not. It is what Black economic power looks like when it is trapped in the reaction layer. And we can do better than this. We have done better than this. And we need to understand exactly why doing better is harder than it sounds. If you're new here, I'm Jice Johnson. I am a business strategist and an economic developer. And on this channel, I talk about business, leadership, and global politics. So if this is landing for you, I want you to like, subscribe, and share and help me reach the people who need to hear it. So let's dig in. Take some notes. I got a history lesson coming up. So the rage cycle works like this. Something egregious happens. It could be a murder, an acquittal, a policy decision, a viral video, something, right? The outrage that follows is very real. It is very earned. In many cases, it is very appropriate and it produces energy. That energy mobilizes people who were not mobilized before. It creates an urgency, it produces solidarity, and it gets pointed at an economic target, right? So boycott this brand, redirect spending over here, stop buying there, bank black, buy black, hire black. And for a moment, it really feels like a movement because it is movement, right? Real dollars have shifted, real attention has moved. But then the resolve that is built on emotion begins to exhaust itself because resolve built on emotion always does. And the crisis that created that urgency gets replaced by the next crisis. The target of the boycott doesn't feel enough economic pain to change its behavior, or it issues some sort of statement and it waits for things to cool down, and then things do cool down, and the community that was mobilized around the specific event begins to disperse. Then 6 months later, a year later, the spending has returned to its original pattern. The infrastructure that was supposed to be built in that window of mobilization was never started. So we wait again till the next tragedy. What makes this a cycle rather than a series of failures is what happens in the in between. And it's not enough. We do not analyze what happened in the last boycott. We do not ask why the resolve faded or what would have been needed to sustain it. We do not build the infrastructure during the quiet period that would make, taking these next steps of mobilization more effective. Instead, we rest. And when the next egregious thing happens, we start all over. Same outrage, same tactics, same ceiling. I want to be clear here that the rage cycle is not a failure of passion. We have never had a shortage of passion. It is a failure, though, of infrastructure. And those two problems are not the same. So I have a history lesson. I want to walk through this because we have over 100 years of this type of action and we should understand it a little bit better. So let's start by talking about what actually worked and why. I want to start with the wins because I do think that, well, because first of all, they are real, right? But they're also a little instructive, not because we should just feel good and stop analyzing, but because what made them work tells us exactly what's missing from everything that did not. So let's talk about our most successful boycott that everyone knows. That is the Montgomery bus boycott, right? We know that. Okay. 1955, 1956. This is where we are. 381 days. Black residents made up approximately 75% of the bus riders. The city lost an estimated $3,000 per day in fare revenue. And I think there's a part of the Montgomery bus boycott story that is almost never told. The infrastructure that made it possible was not built in the days right after Rosa Parks was arrested. It was built over 9 years prior to her arrest. So let's talk about that. You have the Women's Political Council that was founded in Montgomery in 1946. After dozens of Black people had been arrested on city buses, there had been 1 month where over 100 members organized into chapters across every school, every workplace in the city with more than 10 Black employees. So they were targeting, certain aspects of our community. By 1955, it had over 300 members. And this is important. It had networks embedded across working class Black communities. In 1954, the president, Joanne Robinson, she sent a letter to the mayor warning that a boycott was imminent. She had been planning it already for more than a year before that letter. Okay, so this took place in 1954. She was already planning a boycott a year prior to her even sending the letter, right? Then what we have is Rosa Parks being arrested in December of 1955. They did not invent a plan. They activated a plan that had already been developed. Robinson printed out 35,000 leaflets overnight. Distribution routes had already been mapped. Communication networks were already in existence. 9 years of organizing before you have the arrest of Rosa Parks. So much like today, where we would have seen that triggering event, there was a triggering event. But because so much of our history hasn't been taught, we don't know all of the organizing that went into developing the infrastructure prior to that. So I also think that there's just a couple of other aspects that are important to name about Montgomery, right? One is that this was a local action against a local target. The bus company was almost entirely dependent on Black ridership for its survival. That specific, equation there, where the community held almost total economic leverage over a single local institution. It's almost impossible for us to replicate in this multinational corporation world that we live in with diversified revenue, global markets, shareholders, and all of those, other aspects that can absorb a brief boycott without really feeling it. So the lessons of the Montgomery bus boycott are very real, and it's also very specific. And understanding that specificity is a part of building strategy that could work in today's environment. Montgomery worked because it had everything the rage cycle does not. Infrastructure built 9 years before the crisis, alternative systems so that people could sustain the action for over a year, a specific measurable legal target, sustained leadership that was accountable to the community, and it was attached to a broader political and legal campaign, not just an economic action. Now, let's talk about Greenwood, Mississippi. From 1967 to 1969, depending on which sources that you look, it was between an 18 to 20 month boycott of downtown businesses. Now, this was led by local ministers and community organizers. The white community, the violent white racist community, responded with fire bombings, drive-by shootings, court injunctions. The community, though, they held tight despite the violent uprisings. By early 1969, the campaign had forced white shopkeepers to hire Black employees, and it bought paved streets and street lighting to Greenwood's Black neighborhoods. So, roughly 20 months, some very specific demands, right? Community institutions were the organizing backbone of this, and this boycott delivered. Let's talk about another one. Birmingham in 1963. This combined boycotts, sit-ins, and marches, and this paralyzed the business district in Birmingham for 5 weeks. Businesses lost millions of dollars. Sidney Smyer, who is a self-described segregationist, he told his, fellow violent white racists that they had to integrate. His words were, and I'm quoting, "I'm still a segregationist, but I'm not a damn fool." The Birmingham campaign directly pressured President Kennedy to propose the Civil Rights Act. The pattern in every boycott that has delivered that same, what we would call a success, had specific demand, organized infrastructure built before the action started, alternative systems. It sustained long enough to produce real economic pain, and it attached a broader political and legal strategy that could convert economic pressure into policy change. So that is a lot there, but essentially what we've done is covered 3 boycotts. 3. This is important for us to understand. Okay? 3. Let's talk about what partially delivered. So, the most historically significant example that I could find here is the one that I think doesn't get a lot of attention. It is called the Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaigns of the 1930s. First of all, how do you like that for a title? Because I feel like we should be bringing that back, especially with how they have just fired Black men and Black women with this administration. But that's not the point of this video. So I'm going to come back to my notes. But how you like that for a name? Don't Buy Where You Can't Work. Okay. Campaigns of the 1930s. Okay. During the Great Depression, Black organizations in Chicago, New York, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Cleveland, other major cities boycotted white-owned stores in Black neighborhoods that refused to hire Black employees. The organizing was real, the economic pressure was real, and in Chicago alone, the campaign resulted in the hiring of more than 2,000 Black people, mostly as clerks in department stores. And by the early 1940s, there were thousands of Black folks that had obtained employment with public utilities, municipal services, and city transit lines across the North. Now, I'm going to just pause right there before I get back to my notes to talk about how often we do not even go through to look at organizations and look at their org chart and see who's actually running these companies. A lot of them you could see. You could go on to LinkedIn and do a search. But when I go to an organization, and I'll give you a recent example, right? So I'm no longer shopping at Target. First of all, I don't impose my boycott rules on nobody because I boycott a lot of stuff. I don't shop at Target. I don't shop at Walmart. I haven't shopped at Walmart since the murder of Trayvon Martin. But I don't shop at Target. I don't shop at Walmart. I don't shop at Amazon. I don't shop at Home Depot. There's others. But when I'm looking for certain things, I have to think about where I'm going to buy these things because there are places that I don't buy. So one of them that I landed on recently that closed down a lot of their storefronts, but still have their online store is Bed Bath & Beyond. So, normally I would go to Target for all of my bedding and things like that. And so I started to look at some other options. Then I started looking at who owns Bed Bath & Beyond. Then I started looking at who works at Bed Bath & Beyond. And I was like, I don't know if I'm going to shop here. Because while I haven't heard anything specific, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I hadn't heard anything specific that they did that was necessarily egregious. But when I looked at who worked there, I was like, well, I can't find none of us. So you don't have a practice of hiring diversity within your talent pool, right? I got a question about that. Even if it's not a Black person, like if I see no diversity, if I see all white men and white women, I'm like, are you tone deaf? What are we doing? So a lot of us don't get into that, right? But like, don't shop where you don't hire us, even if they don't have that as like a official policy, right? How many of us are looking at who's working at some of these places? But anyway, so let me get back. So here's the thing, though, right? Why do I say this partially worked? The gains were consistently limited, right? We're looking at entry level positions, clerk jobs, not ownership, not management, not structural access to capital. The boycotts were regularly stymied by court injunctions against the picket lines. So the court basically kept interceding there. And then their success was heavily dependent on local press coverage, right? So I named all these cities that were working on this, but a lot of this did not get movement or traction unless the local press was covering it. And without a national coordinating framework to connect city level wins into policy change, the gains were basically absorbed individually rather than compounding into structural power. So a generation later, the civil rights movement essentially revived the same tactic because the infrastructure to build on those earlier wins had not yet been established. So more recently, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, but we have things like the fashion brands backlash, that produced some public apologies and DEI commitments, right? And then those were like quietly rolled back once that pressure dissipated. We have the Target boycott, which produced a one-time concession and no real structural change. So I want to talk a little bit about this because the pattern in partial delivery is also consistent. We have real economic impact, but no accountability infrastructure to hold those gains past the moment of pressure. No legal or political strategies to convert the concessions into policy, and no framework that's connecting local wins into a national direction. So I want to talk about, like, when we're talking about what partially succeeded and what failed, the lines there are that it's a thin line. It's a thin line. So I want to talk about some of the things that failed, right? Let's jump back. We're going to jump back. There were early streetcar boycotts, right? There was actually a wave of them between 1900 and 1910. There were Black folks were boycotting segregated streetcars. They did this across roughly more than 25 cities. Mobile, Savannah, Jacksonville, Richmond, right? In some of these cities, the boycotts were nearly 100% effective in terms of Black participation. So we participated, but they still lost across the board. The boycotts in New Orleans in 1902, right? Richmond in 1904, Savannah in 1906, all of these crumbled under the weight of internal divisions. Us fighting with us, right? And then also organized legal oppression, violent white terrorism, of course, being at some of its highest points, right? No legal strategy to convert this economic pressure into policy change, right? No political protection, things like that. Now, what's important in this space is this was taking place in 1906. I think if we put our thinking caps on, right, our critical thinking caps on, we can see why some of these issues may have been issues back then, but these are some of the same structural failures that we see today, even though we have more tools than what they had back then at that time. So I want to acknowledge that because, again, we're talking about some patterns and cycles here, right? So Nashville, 1905. This was the most instructive failure of the record that I could find, okay? Black residents of Nashville, they organized against segregated streetcars and they built an alternative. They built the Union Transportation Company. This was a Black-owned streetcar line so that the community could move without using the segregated system. They built the infrastructure while they ran the boycott. So the white streetcar companies sabotaged the batteries of their streetcars. And then the city imposed this heavy taxes that was specifically targeting Black-owned companies. So then the company failed. The boycott failed with it, not because the community lacked the will or even lacked their creativity, but because the economic infrastructure didn't have political protection. So it was very vulnerable. Now, we still see this as an issue that we experience again today, right? We see that the policies that are put in place, the tax laws that are put in place, the things that incentivize businesses that are oftentimes out of our reach, right? These things are still in place today. But let's keep going. In 1968, we have the Olympic boycott. Now, this one basically didn't even get off the ground at all. The Olympic Project for Human Rights was led by Harry Edwards. This was proposed to be a complete Black athlete boycott of the Mexico City Olympics with some specific demands. There was to restore Muhammad Ali's title, to remove Avery Brundage as the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, to hire more Black coaches, to ban South Africa, of course, still under apartheid, I believe, at this point, but to ban South Africa and Rhodesia from the games. And essentially, the boycott failed to materialize pretty much at all. Not enough athletes committed. I just want to know, does this sound familiar? Like, don't we have a call right now for athletes to not participate in states who are trying to gerrymander their voting districts? But we don't see enough athlete participation. Okay. Not enough athletes participated. Without a unified organizational infrastructure to hold people to that pledge, individual calculations essentially took over. Now, notably from that time, we have Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who performed the Black Power salute at the podium. And that was a powerful, symbolism, right? But it did not produce anything structurally. They were expelled from the games, they were stripped of their medals, and then they returned home to harassment and death threats, right? So we had an iconic moment, but essentially the boycott that was supposed to, precede it never happened. Now, this is, one more time that I'm going to take to interrupt my notes to tell you that Carlos, John Carlos, sorry, y'all, has a partnership with Actively Black. And recently, due to this racist administration, what we know is that funding for his museum has been pulled. And so right now, I believe it's still going on. Actively Black has a campaign going on that if you support buying the Actively Black wear under his brand line, and I think that they started a GoFundMe or something of that sort as well, but that can support the opening of his museum. So anyway, that's just a caveat there because we're going back into history, right? But ultimately, that boycott produced nothing material for what we needed to have happen structurally. What it produced was an iconic moment. Now, some other ones, I won't get into as much detail, but we have 1963, we have the National Black Christmas boycott. This is when Dr. King called for a nationwide refusal to buy Christmas products to protest racial violence. The campaign did not gain traction nationally. And we had our major civil rights organizations refuse to sponsor it. So without any unity among those national organizations, basically the whole call for the boycott fragmented. And there were some individual cities that maybe ran their own successful versions, like Durham is a notable one. But at the national level, it produced nothing. Again, I feel like we've had parallels, right? Because when we call for not shopping on Black Friday, or when we call for not shopping for the holiday, right? Black folks can't get behind that. Couldn't get behind it in the 60s, can't get behind it now. You have the Bank Black efforts. I'm going to bring it a little bit more current because this is not just stuff that happened then. Bank Black in 2016, after Philando Castile was murdered, we had a wave of Black folks who opened up accounts at Black-owned banks. But within months, most of those accounts had been closed or had gone dormant. There was no framework to sustain those relationships. There was no a collaboration or accord between the Black financial institutions to coordinate the capital. There was no organized mechanism to convert that very emotional activation into anything durable, right? No durable financial commitment. Then we have what happened with the NFL and Colin Kaepernick, right? So we know that Kaepernick was blackballed for kneeling, and there were, calls for Black fans to boycott the NFL that was circulated very widely, right? So I'm a diehard 49ers fan, and I was out here like, okay, well, I guess I'm about to miss my 49ers season. My heart was broken, but I'm with Cap, right? That was what the hashtag was. So here's what we know. TV ratings dropped, and we had some social media energy, and the NAACP called meetings with the NFL, and there were celebrities and activists who publicly declared that they were not watching the Super Bowl. The outcome, Kaepernick still not in the NFL. The NFL settled a collusion lawsuit with him privately for an undisclosed amount. A lot of folks read that as like a buyout or whatever, but not as any sort of vindication. Then, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, you have the NFL who issued statements that were supporting BLM. They released the video. They pledged, $250 million to social justice causes over 10 years, and then basically moved on, because we know that the NFL has not kept their pledge for $250 million, and they're definitely not keeping it now, a few years later after this administration. So there's that. But we have others. I've mentioned before the fashion brands, right? So to bring that back to your memory, that's Gucci and H&M fashion brands. We had this backlash for them creating very racist imagery for their for some of their for some of their brands, right? And so what we got was a public apology and DEI commitments that were then rolled back. We have Target, which obviously is the, one of the most recent ones, right? We definitely know that there were sales that were dropped, but ultimately we had some of that merchandise pulled, and there was no structural change, and there was no concession. Then we have the economic blackout. That was from last year, y'all, just last year. We had web traffic down, store traffic down, one day, no demands, no infrastructure, no follow through. Let's talk about the boycotts with the Asians. This is probably one of the most telling. Within a 15-year period, there are 40 Black-led boycotts of Korean-owned stores that occurred spanning from Los Angeles to DC, due to altercations between Korean store owners and Black customers. And in those same 15 years, local newspapers have reported at least 66 incidences of violence. Now, the two most documented ones, we have the family red apple boycott in Brooklyn in 1990. This is when there was a Haitian woman who was assaulted by employees of a Korean-owned grocery store in Flatbush. The Black protesters called for a boycott of all the Korean-owned stores in the area. Businesses at both of the targeted stores plummeted, and the Korean merchant organizations infrastructure, the Korean merchant organizations pumped $8,000 a month into each store to keep them afloat. The boycott lasted over a year. The stores eventually reopened. There was no structural change, no policy outcome, and the boycott became entangled in these broader, like, racial tensions. Okay, then let's talk about Latasha Harlins, the one that most closely mirrors the current Asian boycott that is being called on today, or whatever y'all want to call it, because y'all are saying now it's like, oh, it's not a boycott, we're just redirecting our spending. Okay, but y'all started off with a boycott, a blackout, however you want to phrase it. I'm saying y'all, but it's really we. And to be clear, I have also gone to go get my nails done at Black-owned salons, so I can tell you about some of the ones that I have frequented, but that's not here or there. When I get mad, it's like, it's y'all, right? It's like, that's y'all best friend, that's y'all cousin, that's y'all auntie, that's your daddy, right? Okay, so y'all, right? Y'all's boycott, but I'm in there with y'all. I'm in here with us. All right, so Latasha Harlins, though. Latasha Harlins, this was in 1992. For some of the younger folks that might be tuning in, you may not know about this, but in 1992 in Los Angeles, right? Well, really, I guess it was the 92, the context to what preceded 92, because the death was in 91. The murder was in 91. So in 1991, there was a convenience store owner, Soon Jong-do, who shot and killed 15-year-old Latasha Harlins after wrongfully accusing her of shoplifting orange juice. Now, we all know that security footage showed Harlins had the money in her hand to pay, do serve no jail time, and Harlins' death was directly cited as a catalyst for the 1992 Los Angeles uprising. Um, but during that uprising, Korean stores were specifically targeted and destroyed. Now, I would say that this was more of a riot and not necessarily a boycott, but again, it produced nothing structural in terms of changes for our community. It did devastate Korean, American business owners, at that time, but it didn't change anything for our community. So the pattern in failure is identical across like a full century, right? No unified organizational commitment. No, I'm trying to drive it in. Repetition is how we learn it, right? No legal, no political strategy, no, converting economic pressure into policy changes. We had internal divisions, right? That were definitely exploited by external forces for sure. And in the cases where we had infrastructure that was built, oftentimes infrastructure was destroyed before it could compound. But in many of these cases, infrastructure was never even built. So I feel like it's super important to acknowledge in this space. And I need to take a breath because that was a lot of history. But when I come out and I am I am exhausted from the conversation around boycotts because I feel like we've lost the plot. Like, we don't know enough of the history to know what made something work, what didn't make it work. And so we use these half-baked examples. It's really the same thing when we talk about Tulsa and how much our money circulated around before acknowledging that Tulsa was in a segregated community and that Black folks weren't invited or allowed to or welcome to shop everywhere. We keep looking at these examples without being able to apply a critical lens as to what made the example work or what made it not work, right? So we have been proposing solutions for over 100 years. Every generation has produced the analysis and the framework and the organizing vision, and the solutions have not failed from a lack of intelligence or in a lot of cases, even a lack of commitment. They have been, in a lot of cases, they have been stopped. And we should also name what has stopped them with the same type of precision as we are looking at what made them, in the cases that they were, successful. So without digging too deep into this, like, what did also contribute to the stoppage of what we are seeing, right? State violence. Fred Hampton, 21. He's literally one of my favorite activists. Fred Hampton, 21, right? So we know that the FBI coordinated his murder with the Chicago police, where he was building the Rainbow Coalition, right? And what he was doing was he was essentially developing the framework as every collective power framework, prescribes, right? And he was killed for it. Medgar Evans, Malcolm X, right? When organizing gets real and it is a threat to the existing power structure, then the response has been lethal. So we know that. COINTELPRO. I did a whole video on what goes on with this surveillance area in this issue. But we know for sure, we have documented, proof, right, that the FBI ran a mandate to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and neutralize Black political organizations. And a lot of that was by developing and creating manufactured internal conflict, right? Legal harassment that was designed to drain organizing energy into legal defense, right? So we spend a lot of our time defending ourselves legally versus moving the movement forward where we need them to go. We also have desegregation that I mentioned, right? As this double-edged sword. So on the one side, we don't want to be pigeonholed into where we have to buy, but the way they opened up integration really destroyed the captive markets that made our parallel economic systems viable. And when we gained essentially the legal access to shop with white businesses, we did so under an economic infrastructure that never offered equal opportunity, right? Because it opened up the markets without capital parity. It opened up the markets without the same access to credit or the same access to supply chain relationships or political protection, right? So it just essentially opened us up with not being ill-equipped, being not equipped at all to operate in the playing field that they had opened up. But then this is the one that I think is most important, which is co-option, right? This is when leaders are often, and leaders are often proximity to power, right? So they're offered financial access, platforms, and protection in exchange for moderating collective demand. We see this in the Democratic Party all the time. We see this in the false prophets of capitalism right now, right? They get an invitation to the table, a corporate board seat, a government appointment, some major grant, and the offer is real, the resources are real, and then what happens is that individual access to power historically has not translated into structural benefit for the collective. And instead, the representative at the table becomes accountable to the table rather than accountable to the community that sent them. And the community loses its pressure without gaining the outcome that the pressure was meant to produce. I don't think that this is a conspiracy. This is how the institutions have absorbed dissent, and it has worked consistently enough that it remains one of the most reliable tools in the playbook, even presently. So I'm going to wrap us up. I want to say something that I think is important for us to recognize, and I think it requires for us to maybe have a uncomfortable conversation or realization. And I want to say this, I'm open for pushback. Tell me something I don't know, right? This is how I see it. This is how I see it after studying the data. We have proposed solutions for over 100 years. Brilliant people, the best of us, right? Serious frameworks, real organizing. And we have been doing it inside of this sort of theory of change, if you will, that I think has a fundamental flaw, that no amount of better execution is going to fix. I think that this flaw is that too many of our strategies have been built on the assumption that the system will eventually respond morally. That if we apply enough economic pressure, demonstrate enough unity, make our humanity visible enough, that somewhere in here justice is going to follow. That the system, if it's pushed hard enough, will do the right thing. And a century of evidence says otherwise. I'm not here to be cynical. This is what the documentation says, that the system that enslaved Black people for 250 years did not end slavery because it developed a conscience. It ended it because there was an economic and political cost to the Civil War, and that cost exceeded maintaining the war. The system that maintained Jim Crow did not dismantle it because white business owners in Birmingham had some sort of moral awakening. That man I mentioned, Sidney Smyer, his own words said exactly what it is. He said, and I am quoting again, "I am still a segregationist. I am not a damn fool." He integrated because the boycott made segregation more expensive than integration. This is a power calculation. It's not a moral one. And for centuries, this system has proven consistently, without exception, that it will not extend moral regard to Black people voluntarily. It's not going to extend respect, not dignity, not equity, not even fair transaction, not even just business. It's not doing that. It has expanded globally. It's redefined itself legally and has deployed violence in increasingly sophisticated forms. Not because it has lost its way, but because violent extraction and control of resources is what this system is designed to produce. And you cannot appeal to the conscience of an institution that was architecturally designed to produce the outcome that it is in fact producing. I don't think that this means that nothing can change, but I do think that we have to be precise about what change it can produce. Um, Power, specifically power that forces a calculation that the system can't avoid. Power that makes the alternative more expensive than compliance, and power that controls enough votes or enough markets or enough capital and the narrative that the system has to negotiate it rather than ignore it. Power that cannot be neutralized by co option or legislation because it is embedded in the framework infrastructure, right? And not in the individual leaders or single organizations layer. So, when we're talking about think tanks and political infrastructure and accords and coordinated strategy, we should be clear about what we are building toward, right? We are not building toward a more just system. We are building toward enough leverage that the system is forced to recalculate. Those two things are not the same. And conflating them leads us back to the same theory of change that has failed us for 100 years. This is what the framework layer, I believe, can actually produce. It can shift power calculations, so to speak. It can make certain behaviors more costly than the alternatives. And it can create conditions where the system has no rational choice but to accommodate demands where it would otherwise attempt to ignore them. What it cannot produce is moral transformation in a system that was not built on moral foundations. And I feel like that has to be said because when you get to folks, right, many of us are just, we're not violent. We want to kumbaya and love everybody. There are many of us who have diverse friend groups or peer groups or colleagues and we want to see that people will see our humanity, and we want to believe that that will produce a transformation in the system if we just get enough people to see it. What this system cannot produce is a moral transformation. This system is not built on a moral foundation. We should be able to build with very clear eyes about that ceiling. Not because the ceiling is to discourage us, but because knowing the ceiling tells us exactly what we are building and exactly what we can claim as a win. So the infrastructure layer, the political protection layer, the framework layer, right? Like these are not tools for making the system better. They are tools for building power that the system has to reckon with. There is a difference, right? The first, the better system requires the system's cooperation to work. Building a power that the system has to recognize, it does not. So we have to build towards leverage, and we have to be honest about what leverage can actually produce, right? I think we have to build toward enough leverage that the system is forced to recalculate. I'm hoping I'm making that clear. We are not building toward a more just system. These are not the same. And we have often conflated them. And that has cost us. That's cost us. So I want to end with this question. This is my second Baptist close, but I want to end with this question because I think that this is the most important question out of the whole conversation. This really isn't a strategic question, it is a cultural question. This is something I have really tried to reckon with is why do we need a dead baby to decide to build? And I'm really not asking that question rhetorically. I've asked this question before, but I ask it again because we're talking about the rage cycle. And that rage cycle often begins with the egregious. And these egregious acts are often acts of violence against our community. This is our literal blood, y'all, in the streets. I'm not asking this question rhetorically. I am asking it as a genuine question about how we have structured our relationship to collective action. We mobilize in response to injustice. All of these responses are legitimate and they are all also reactive. Every single one of them is reactive. And reaction, by definition, happens after the damage is done. The question is, when will we become internally motivated enough to build without requiring external provocation to get started? When the decision to support Black businesses, to redirect capital, to build cooperative infrastructure, to organize politically becomes something that we do because we decided to do it and not because something made us angry enough to act. Reaction is a survival tactic. It is what you do when something happens that demands a response. But intention is a thriving tactic. It is what you do because you decided where you are going to go and where you are going to move, and you start moving toward it regardless of what the news cycle is doing. The rage cycle does not end because the outrage stops. It ends when the decision to build becomes the default and not the exception. And when the infrastructure exists before the crisis is demanding it, when the boycott is one tool inside of a larger strategy rather than the entire strategy, when we decide that we stop needing permission from a tragedy to do what we already know needs to be done. We have done it before. We have 100 years of a clear pattern, more insight into what works and what doesn't. And the question now is whether we decide to break it. So if this landed for y'all, this landed for you, share this video because there are people in your circle, as in mine, who are still trapped in the rage cycle because nobody has named the pattern clearly enough for them to see it. So send it to them. Next week, I'm recording this on the 30th, but next week, next Thursday, I am doing my deep dive live over on Substack, where I'm talking about 5 issues live that I think we need to be paying attention to in our community. I do this live every 2 weeks. It's bi-weekly. It is for my paid subscribers only. But if you support this work, then I encourage you to become a paid subscriber and have that conversation live with me. The link will be in the description, and I will see y'all on the next one.